Before dawn, on a frozen morning in October 1941, German soldiers standing on the edge of a ruined Soviet city saw something that made them pause. Through the smoke and snow, a tank rolled forward. Then another. Then another. These were not factory-fresh machines shipped from the Urals. These tanks were built inside the city itself, under siege, by starving civilians who should not have been able to build anything at all. If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below. The Germans had planned for soldiers, artillery, and air power. They had not planned for ordinary people turning bombed factories into weapons of war. And in that moment, the balance of fear shifted. To understand why this shocked the German army so deeply, we have to go back to the summer of 1941, when Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22nd. It was the largest invasion in human history. More than 3 million German and Axis troops crossed into the Soviet Union. Hitler believed the Red Army would collapse in weeks. German generals spoke openly of reaching Moscow before winter. Soviet cities fell one after another. Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev. Millions of Soviet soldiers were captured. Entire units vanished. By September, the road to Moscow seemed open. One of the key targets on that road was Leningrad, today known as St. Petersburg. The city was not just symbolic. It was an industrial giant. It produced tanks, artillery, ammunition, and ships. It was also the birthplace of the Bolshevik Revolution, which gave it enormous political value. Hitler decided Leningrad would not be stormed. It would be erased. The plan was simple and cruel. Surround the city, cut off supplies, and let it starve. By September 8, 1941, German Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, had completed the encirclement. Finnish forces closed in from the north. Leningrad was cut off from the rest of the Soviet Union. Inside the city were more than 2.5 million civilians, including 400,000 children. Food stocks were dangerously low. Winter was approaching fast. At the same time, hundreds of kilometers south, another city was preparing for a similar fate. Kharkov, a major industrial center in Ukraine, had tank factories that produced the T-34, the most feared Soviet tank of the war. As German Army Group South advanced, Soviet authorities faced a terrible choice: evacuate the factories east or keep producing under threat of capture. In many cases, they tried to do both, but the most dramatic story of civilians building tanks under siege belongs to Leningrad. Inside Leningrad stood the Kirov Plant, officially known as Factory No. 100. Before the war, it produced heavy machinery and the KV series of heavy tanks, named after Kliment Voroshilov. When the siege began, evacuation was only partially successful. Some machines and workers were sent east to Chelyabinsk, but thousands of skilled workers remained trapped inside the city. On September 10, 1941, just 2 days after the siege was sealed, the State Defense Committee issued an urgent order. Tank production inside Leningrad was to continue at all costs. Not next month, not when conditions improved, immediately. This order reached people who had not eaten properly in weeks. The workers of the Kirov plant were not soldiers. They were machinists, welders, engineers, and teenagers trained on the job. Many were women. Many had family members already dead or dying from hunger. Daily bread rations would soon drop to 250 grams for workers and 125 grams for dependents. That was barely enough to survive, let alone work 12-hour shifts in freezing workshops. Electricity was unreliable. Bombs fell daily. German artillery shelled the city from the south. Luftwaffe bombers attacked factories deliberately. On September 19th, a massive air raid hit industrial zones, setting fuel and warehouses on fire. Yet the machines inside the Kirov plant kept running. The tanks built there were not perfect. Paint was thin. Some parts were rough. But they were real tanks, with real armour and real guns. By late September, the first KV-1 tanks built entirely under siege conditions rolled out of the factory gates. They did not go onto trains. There were no trains. Instead, they drove directly to the front lines on the outskirts of the city. In some cases, factory workers climbed onto the tanks and rode them straight into battle as emergency crews. German troops of the 18th Army, commanded by General Georg von Küchler, began encountering these tanks during probing attacks south of Leningrad, near the towns of Pushkin and Kolpino. They had expected Soviet resistance to weaken as supplies ran out. Instead, they faced heavy tanks emerging almost out of nowhere. German after-action reports mention surprise at the continued appearance of armoured vehicles inside the encirclement. Intelligence officers struggled to explain how tanks were still being produced. From the German perspective, a city under total siege should not be able to replace heavy equipment losses. But Leningrad was doing exactly that. As autumn turned to winter, conditions inside the city became almost unbearable. By November 1941, temperatures dropped below -20 degrees Celsius. The Neva River froze. Food stocks collapsed. People collapsed in the streets. Thousands died every day. Yet inside the factories, production continued. To save fuel, workshops were unheated. Workers wore multiple layers of clothing. Oil froze inside machines. To keep them running, workers used blowtorches and heated metal parts over open flames. People fainted at their stations. Others died standing up. Still, tanks were built. The Kirov plant was not alone. Smaller factories and workshops across Leningrad were converted to produce parts, ammunition, and repairs. Damaged tanks were dragged back from the front, fixed with improvised tools, and sent out again. Some tanks went into battle with factory chalk markings still visible on their armour. German soldiers noticed something else. These tanks often appeared at critical moments during Soviet counterattacks launched when German units believed the defenders were exhausted. On December 5, 1941, as the Red Army launched its winter counter-offensive near Moscow, local counterattacks around Leningrad intensified as well. One German infantryman later wrote that it felt as if the city itself was fighting back. But Leningrad was not the only place where civilians built tanks under siege. In Stalingrad, the story would become even more famous. By August 1942, German 6th Army under General Friedrich Paulus reached the Volga River. Stalingrad, a long industrial city stretching along the riverbank, became the focal point of the campaign. Luftwaffe bombing turned large sections of the city into rubble. Civilians were trapped among the ruins. Inside Stalingrad stood the Dzerzhinsky Tractor Factory, the Red October Steel Plant, and the Barrikady Factory. Before the war, these factories produced tractors, steel, and artillery. When the Germans approached, production shifted overnight. At the Dzerzhinsky factory, workers assembled T-34 tanks while German artillery shells landed inside the factory grounds. On August 23, 1942, the Luftwaffe launched one of the most destructive air raids of the war. Fires burned for days, yet within weeks, tank production resumed. What shocked German troops was how close these tanks were built to the front. In some cases, tanks rolled straight from the factory floor into combat, firing their guns before the paint had dried. Crews included factory workers and soldiers mixed together. Some tanks entered battle without full sights or radios. German soldiers advancing through Stalingrad reported being attacked by tanks emerging from smoke-filled ruins they thought were abandoned. The idea that civilians could build tanks in a city being destroyed block by block was hard to accept. Back in Leningrad, the siege dragged on into 1942 and 1943. More than 1 million civilians died, mostly from starvation. Yet tank production never fully stopped. Even as factories were damaged, production shifted to basements and smaller workshops. The psychological effect on German troops was real. German doctrine relied on destroying enemy industry and logistics. Leningrad violated that logic. Despite isolation, bombing, and hunger, the city continued to produce heavy weapons. This forced German commanders to divert artillery and air power to target factories instead of frontline troops. It also forced them to reconsider the assumption that the Soviet war effort would collapse under pressure. By January 1943, the Red Army launched Operation Iskra, breaking the Siege of Leningrad by opening a narrow land corridor along the southern shore of Lake Ladoga. Supplies began to flow again. Tank production increased. When the siege was finally lifted completely on January 27, 1944, Soviet officials counted hundreds of tanks built and repaired inside the city during the blockade. Each one represented not just steel and guns, but human endurance beyond what most armies believed possible. German soldiers who survived the Eastern Front often spoke of Soviet resilience with a mix of respect and fear. The tanks built by civilians under siege became symbols of that resilience. This was not propaganda alone. It was documented reality. Factory logs, military reports, and eyewitness accounts all confirm the same thing. When German troops expected silence and surrender, they instead met steel rolling out of starving cities. In the end, the story of civilians building tanks under siege is not just about machines. It is about time, pressure, and human choice. In Leningrad and Stalingrad, people who could barely stand chose to keep working, not because it was easy, or safe, or even logical, but because stopping meant defeat. And for the German troops who faced those tanks, the message was clear. This war would not end quickly, it would not end cleanly, and it would demand a price far greater than anyone had imagined on that quiet morning in June 1941. If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.